Hello, this is Nick Freitas, and welcome back to Making the Argument, Gun Edition. That's right. We're going to talk about the Second Amendment today, and the reason why we're going to talk about it is because the same politicians that generally run saying things like nobody wants to take your guns. Well, they're in power now, and it turns out, guess what? They do want to take your guns. They want to take lots of your guns. Because apparently, you as a law-abiding citizen, having the means to be able to defend yourself, your property, your family, we're the problem. We're the problem. It's not people that they're releasing from prison early, which we'll talk about that later in the show on the parole board here in Virginia. It's not the fact that there's actually dangerous people out there that are committing crimes, and certain politicians, almost all of which happen to be Democrats, want to make sure that they get out of prison as early as possible. Right? That's not the problem. No, the problem is, you owning a semi-automatic pistol or you owning an AR-15. That is apparently the big problem that Democrats want to tackle with respect to keeping our streets safer. So let's talk about it. Let's talk a little bit about some of the legislation they have up. Now, I've given a lot of arguments on why the Second Amendment exists, but I'm going to rehash one of them right now because I think it's important. Right? When you look at the Second Amendment, right, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Why is it there? Why is it worded that way? Well, as I've explained before, there's two arguments made within that statement, all right, within that terminology. The first one, talking about a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, what the government is doing is it's acknowledging that individuals having a right to own firearms is necessary not only for their security, it's necessary for a free society. It's necessary for a free state to be able to protect a free state from tyranny, whether that tyranny come from abroad, whether it come from within. It's necessary for free people to be able to have an individual right to own firearms in order to defend not only themselves, but the state. Why did they believe this? Well, I don't know. Go read Machiavelli. Go look at what happened to the Roman Republic. You go look at what happened to the Roman Republic when it moved into the Roman Empire, and all of a sudden standing armies essentially worked for whichever general had the most cash on hand at the time, right? And you look at what Machiavelli wrote about in The Prince, talking about mercenaries and essentially the people within that apparatus understanding that they were stronger than the people they were protecting and taking over. Now, am I in any way, shape, or form suggesting that our own military, our own police force, wants to do that in our country? No, I'm not suggesting that. I was active duty Army for 11 years. What I'm saying is that if you don't actually look at the historical context and the reasons for why that first portion of the Second Amendment was put in there, then you are going to miss something, because ultimately, human nature doesn't change, right? Human behavior can change, norms and practices can change, laws can change, but human nature is pretty much similar going all the way back to antiquity to now. Now, we can make a lot of progress with respect to, again, how we treat one another, how we protect people before the law, but ultimately, right, there is a self-destructive nature about humanity that we're trying to hold at bay. And one of the ways that the founders sought to do that within the Second Amendment was to recognize that individual gun ownership is a stopgap against tyranny. It's how free societies remain free. Okay, so that was the government's interest in the individual ownership of firearms. The second part, again, the comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, made it abundantly clear that they weren't just talking about owning a firearm with respect to your duties in a militia. They were talking about owning a firearm as an individual right. And again, this goes back to that whole philosophical argument that as a free person, you have an inherent right to be able to defend yourself. And any government that seeks to significantly curtail or take away that right is doing what I like to call turning citizens into subjects. And yet we've seen it all over the Western world lately, and we're seeing it once again here in the United States. I mean, we've seen it here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where the same people that said nobody wants to take your guns showed up, got power, and lo and behold, they wanted to take your guns. So how exactly are they doing it? Because again, once again, even in the midst of trying to take your guns, they're not sitting here going, we're going to take your guns, right? I mean, at least Beto O'Rourke was honest about it. Now, I don't know if that's just because he's an honest guy or because he doesn't understand, like most of the people that want to do this sort of stuff, that you don't say the quiet parts out loud, but he was at least honest about it. So let's talk about House Resolution 8 and some of the other gun legislation we're seeing up at the federal level right now. And there's essentially four four things that they're going after as part of their common sense gun legislation. By the way, in case you didn't know, politicians believe that if they say common sense in front of whatever they want to do next, it automatically makes it common sense, right? No need to actually provide a coherent argument. As long as they add the word common sense in front of something, it's common sense. Just like if they add the word justice onto something, it automatically achieves just results. So they do the same thing with guns. So let's look at this. So the first thing they're going after is they want universal background checks. Here's, and again, most people, they look at that, they think, well, that makes sense. Universal background checks, right? Yeah, you can go buy a gun, but we should at least make sure you're not a criminal first before you buy the gun. That already takes place with almost every single gun transaction that takes place in America. You walk into a store, you get a background check. You typically get one at the state level and at the federal level. And it's pretty quick, it's pretty instantaneous. But when they talk about universal background checks, that's because that sounds a whole lot better than what they're actually trying to get at, which is universal gun registration. Because the only way that they can actually do a universal background check, right? Because if I give a gun to my child on their 21st birthday and I say, son, here's a rifle, or sweetheart, here's a pistol to be able to defend yourself, right? I can't just, now you're saying that we have to go through background checks in order for that transaction to take place, right? So universal background checks, what they really mean is universal gun registration. Now and maybe you think that's perfectly fine. Okay, if you think that's perfectly fine, here's what I want to ask you. Do you think it's a good idea for the government, right, the only entity in the country that is allowed to use aggressive legal force, do you really think it's a good idea for them to know what guns everybody in the country owns? And if you do, well, then here's what I'd like you to consider. This has been done before, and this has been done before in some pretty oppressive regimes. It's been done in other places that have not gone full oppression yet, but in places like Australia, they started off, well, we're going to have universal gun registration, right, because that's common sense. Well, what happened next? Confiscation laws, right? You see the similar things in Canada and the UK and in other places around the world. Because once they know where they're all at, now it becomes a lot easier for them to engage in confiscation because now they can threaten you. If they don't know that you have, two pistols and a rifle, well, they can pass all the gun confiscation laws they want, but they're not going to go door to door searching everybody's house. But at the moment they make you register it, well, now they don't have to do that. They can simply threaten you, and if you don't turn it in on time, all of a sudden now they can show up with the police and they can arrest you, or they can confiscate your property, or they can put you in jail, or they can give you a fine or a fee. Right, so that is what they want. That is what they want with universal background checks. They want universal gun registration, right? And look, they put a couple things. I'm going to read off a couple things that they put in here. And the whole idea is that, well, hey, look, we understand, we're reasonable, so we're going to do an emergency exception. So what was their emergency exception? This comes courtesy of Gun Owners of America, who did a great job of researching this. I want to give a shout out to Eric Pratt and all the guys over there at Gun Owners of America. But the bill purports to exempt the gun owner in an emergency. But if he hands a firearm to a friend because they hear a noise in the house in the middle of the night, and the noise turns out to be a teenage son, you're a criminal, right? So there you go, the emergency exception. The emergency exception is written in such a way to where it doesn't even come close to covering any number of things that could be considered an actual emergency. All right, what's another one? The hunting exception. The bill purports to exempt the hunter. But if he hands his gun to a hunting partner and unknown to him, the partner doesn't have a hunting license, he's a criminal, right? So I want you to imagine this. You're out there, you're hunting with your friend or whatnot, and maybe he's just coming along. Maybe he's not even hunting himself, and you hand your rifle real quick because nature calls, right? Are you supposed to be a criminal at that point? If the game warden comes up, really, is that the intention here? But again, that's what happens when you don't actually understand what it is that you're writing. And then there's the relative exception. The bill purports to exempt transfers from a gun owner to his relatives. So just like I said before, right? My kid turns 21. I give him one of my firearms so they can, protect themselves or go hunting or whatever it is. But if I gave my gun to my in-law, he's a criminal. If he gives a gun to his stepson, he's a criminal. If he gives a gun to his great-grandson, he's a criminal, right? So once again, this exemption that they've put in place is not an exemption. They're trying to put something out there. Why? Because they know MSNBC, CNN, and everyone else will go out there and say, well, they've made exceptions for emergencies and hunting and for transfers to relatives, because they don't have any intention to actually look at what this will actually do, because the fix is in, right? What they want is to get guns out of the hands of citizens, not criminals, because they can't wait to let criminals out of jail early. But no, but you, because again, you're the problem, right? You're the problem. Right? What's another thing you want to do in here? Oh, okay, I love this. They want to ban assault weapons. Okay, as I've explained before, what is an assault weapon? Well, apparently to some of my colleagues in the General Assembly and to people in Congress, an assault weapon is essentially that anything that looks scary, anything that looks scary. If they've seen it in a Rambo movie, it is automatically an assault weapon, right? If they've seen it in any sort of war movie, it's automatically an assault weapon. Or as we had one delegate in the General Assembly, when someone asked him an honest question, like, how do you define assault weapon? He literally put his hands down by his hips like he was holding a gun. And he said, an assault weapon is one that you fire like this. And he waved his arms back and forth, again, like he was in a Rambo movie. Right? So clearly a firearms expert. All right. So what's my expertise? And I'm not trying to appeal to authority fallacy here. I'm just trying to say that, yeah, I do know a little bit about what I'm talking about. So before I got into politics, right, before a person that I thought was a friend of mine convinced me to run for office, I was a Green Beret. And specifically within Special Forces, I was an 18 Bravo, a Special Forces weapons sergeant. Now, I would say that arguably, an 18 Bravo goes through more diverse weapons training than probably anybody else in the military. There may be some exceptions. And when I say diverse weapons training, I mean different styles of weapons, rifles, pistols, submachine guns, machine guns, heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, RPGs, mortars. Like there probably isn't anybody else in the military that goes through as diverse a weapons training as a Special Forces weapons sergeant does. So I know what most people think when they think assault weapon. They're typically thinking a fully automatic weapon, which means I pull the trigger and I hold it and the weapon continues to fire. Okay? Now, bottom line is that in the United States of America, if you actually want a license to own a machine gun, you have to go through numerous background checks. You have to register. You have to go through all these loopholes in order to do that. You cannot walk in right now and go buy a fully automatic weapon. Right? And we can argue all day long on whether or not that's a bad idea. But just for the purposes of what we're talking about right now, that sort of weapon you cannot just go into a store and buy. You just can't. Okay? So for everyone that's terrified out there, so what do? They start adding all these other criteria. Well, it's got a pistol grip. So what? What does a pistol grip make a rifle an assault weapon? It doesn't. That makes no sense. It has a barrel shroud. A barrel shroud is simply something that goes over the barrel that shrouds it so you don't touch the barrel, right, and burn yourself when you fire it. Right? There's nothing about a barrel shroud that makes something, quote, an assault weapon. It's absolutely absurd. We actually had someone come to the Virginia General Assembly and give really good testimony about the reason why he actually owned an AR or he owned a rifle with a pistol grip was because of a physical disability he had that made it very, very difficult for him to fire a rifle that did not have a pistol grip. Right, so is that the guy that the Democrats are trying to hammer right now? Is he the problem? They have a pistol grip because it's ergonomically more sound in some respects. Right? There's nothing assaulty about a pistol grip or a barrel shroud. The other one I love is a bayonet lug. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yes, there are all kinds of rifles that were typically military grade rifles that came with bayonet lugs. I believe the last genuine bayonet charge in U.S. military history was actually conducted by Colonel Lott in the Korean War. There may have been others, but I know that is listed as one of the kind of officialized bayonet charge. I don't know of too many cases in the United States where there's been just a rash of violence because someone fixed bayonets and ran into the grocery store, right? I'm sorry, I don't see that happening. I don't think we have any evidence of that happening, right? But all of a sudden you have a place where you could fix a bayonet on a rifle, which again is more and more becoming an antique thing. And all of a sudden that makes something an assault rifle. So it's just ignorance and stupidity. And they've written this to some degree to where now assault weapons could be defined as any sort of real semi-automatic rifle or even arguably semi-automatic pistols. Right, so that's what we're talking about here. It's just again, It's dangerous because you're making it incredibly difficult for a law-abiding citizen to own like just a standard small arm, a standard rifle, a standard pistol, right? A standard shotgun. Um, it, it's just incredible. But on top of that, it's not as if you made it more difficult for the bad guy to get it. So let's move on to the thing. So that first one, universal background checks, which is really universal gun registration. That's what they want, and you need universal gun registration if you really want to get to the business of confiscation, which is clearly what they really want. Then it's banning assault weapons. They never really clearly define an assault weapon, or they write it so broadly that it includes so many things that I think most people that know nothing about guns would never assume would be considered an assault weapon. The next one is they talk about high capacity magazines. So what's a high capacity magazine? Well, apparently it's anything more than 10 rounds. Again, this is so again, the same people that said nobody wants to take your guns are now saying that if you own a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds, which by the way, the typical magazine for a Springfield XD or a Glock 19 carries around 15 rounds, right? That's fairly standard, 15 rounds. So basically, you're criminalizing millions of magazines out there. In Virginia, they actually had a bill where it would have been a class 1 misdemeanor to have a magazine over 12 rounds. Or to give you an idea, what that means is that for every magazine that you have, and typically when someone goes and buys a pistol, look at 2 magazines, you could spend up to 2 years in jail because you have those 2 magazines, right? Because that's going to make us safer. Well done, sir. No. Right? And again, the whole idea of high capacity magazines. All right, well, let's look at other states where they've actually banned them. They did this in California. How did it work out? Well, it turns out there was no discernible difference with a lot of the gun laws that they put in place to include things like high capacity magazines. No discernible difference. All right, so what's the fourth one? All right, the fourth one is they're going after gun manufacturers, right? And we see this all the time. You actually see the conditioning of this in things like with COVID, where the government knew that it didn't have the law enforcement capacity to be able to enforce the rules it was putting out. So what did it do? It told businesses that if they didn't essentially become an enforcement mechanism for the government, they could lose their licenses, they could have problems with the health department, et cetera. So they actually made companies an enforcement arm of the government. And that's what they're essentially trying to do here. They're creating situations where now, if a particular firearm gets used, or what was it Biden said, if gun manufacturers knowingly put weapons of war onto our streets. Dude, bows and arrows are a weapon of war. Swords and knives are a weapon of war. Pistols are a weapon of war. Rifles are a weapon. You want to know what a weapon of war is? From someone that's actually been to war. A weapon of war can be anything that you use as an implement to either conduct defensive or offensive operations. That's a weapon of war. Right? So, but they use these terms because they want to implant this imagery in your head that people are rolling around in an M1 Abrams tank. So now what they're trying to do is they're turning on the manufacturers. If they can't stop the demand, because it turns out that free people like to be able to defend themselves. If they can't stop the demand, well, then they're going to hurt the supply. They're going to run them out of business. They're going to allow them to be sued because their product was used in a violent and criminal way. Great. Well, I can't wait for us to start suing General Motors every time someone uses one of their vehicles for a getaway car. Because if this is the sort of logic that we're using now, well then, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. We're not talking about suing a gun manufacturer because they made a faulty firearm that resulted in injury to the user. No. We're saying that a bad guy decided to use a tool for a bad purpose, and now the person that created the tool is the bad guy. I mean, my gosh, Louisville Slugger, you're in trouble because it turns out bats are used to kill more people than AR-15s in this country. And don't even get me started on hammer manufacturers. This, again, they want to make this sound like it's a reasonable concession. No, it isn't. It is just one more way. They're attacking demand, and now they want to attack supply. And this is all an assault on your basic fundamental right to be able to defend yourself. And the other reason why this makes me so angry and so frustrated is because at the same time they are telling law-abiding citizens we are going to make it significantly more difficult for you to be able to own a firearm. They have parole boards that are letting violent criminals out. I'm not talking about a marijuana charge, right? Look, you legalize marijuana for all I care. I'm talking about people that, in one case here in Virginia, just recently, a parole board released somebody that executed a police officer. And when he got out and was asked if he had any regrets, he said no. Now, when the General Assembly requested the report, because there was an Inspector General report of that parole board to determine whether or not they actually followed procedure and followed the law with respect to that decision, we were given a 6-page redacted version of the report. For those of you who don't know, redacted means that's the part where they black out in the text things that they don't want you to read. We came back as the General Assembly and said, last time we checked, we are the General Assembly, we are the legislature, we are a co-equal branch of government, and we don't want a redacted IG report, we want the full IG report. So they gave us an unredacted 6-page report. Turns out later on, it was actually a 13-page report. And in that 13-page report, the Inspector General came up with several instances where the Inspector General believes the potential violations of not only procedure, but of Virginia law took place. Well, guess what? The 2 people that were actually potentially guilty, again, I'm not like some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I'll say potentially guilty until it's actually been proven in a court of law that they're guilty, but the Inspector General sure seems convinced. The 2 people that were most responsible within this report, right, was the head of the parole board and her deputy. Well, the head of the parole board just became a judge. The Democrats just nominated her and voted her in as a judge in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and her deputy got promoted to the head of the parole board. So that's not a threat to our safety. But you owning a firearm, that's a threat. That's what's making our streets dangerous. By the way, where is this gun violence predominantly taking place? Just out of curiosity. Because out of the 40,000 gun deaths, and yes, that is a horrific number, out of the 40,000 gun deaths, over 60% of them are suicides. And that is tragic. And there are a number of ways that we should make sure that we come alongside and help people that are dealing with suicide, that are dealing with thoughts of suicide, and seek to assist them. But punishing every single gun owner or potential gun owner because somebody is battling with those demons doesn't sound like a very common sense approach to me. All right, when you take off the 60+%, most of those other homicides are taking place as a result of violent crime that's taking place in cities. Quick question. Who's been running the cities for the last 4 decades? Has it been a bunch of wild-eyed Second Amendment supporting conservatives? No, it's been progressive Democrats for almost 40 years. Maybe, I'm just going to throw this out there, maybe the problem with the high crime that we see is not so much a result of law-abiding citizens not being able to own guns and defend themselves in their communities and their neighborhoods. Maybe it's because you keep going soft on people that have actually committed acts of violence against innocent people, and then you let them out of jail early, at the same time that you let them back out into a population that you've made it incredibly difficult for them to be able to defend themselves. Maybe that has more to do with it. I don't know, because you've been instituting these policies now for decades. One might think you would have some bang-up results to show us, but you don't. It's just the opposite. And then when the police have to cover down on it, you attack the police. And then your next strategy is defund the police. So now, this is brilliant. It was bad enough when you said that the only people that were going to have guns, period, was the government, because you were going to take them away from law-abiding citizens or make it difficult for them to have it. Then you were going to let people that had actually committed acts of violence out early. Now your solution is, you know what, maybe we should take the guns away, or maybe we should take the cops off the streets too. Brilliant. Just brilliant. I'm so glad you guys are in charge of making laws. Oh my gosh. I can't imagine why so many people in this country are skeptical about the common sense phrase and terminology that you throw onto each of these bills. Can't imagine why they're skeptical. You know, quite frankly, I don't fear my constituents being able to defend themselves. I don't fear them being able to defend themselves. I want them to be able to do that. But unfortunately, we have a lot of people in government, not just at the state level, but at the federal level, that are no longer interested in that. So I'm a little bit more animated this time. I'm making the argument. We really try, I really do try to make a calm, cool, collected argument, but I am so fed up with this because I'm tired of being lied to. If you are someone that genuinely believes that we need stricter gun control, and you are willing to come forward and you're willing to say, Nick, I understand we have a different viewpoint. This is why I think we need more gun control. This is how I'd implement it. This is exactly what I'd do, and this is the results that I think will be achieved by it. I will be so happy to sit down with you, have a civil discussion, look at your data, offer my own data. Then we can each provide a philosophical and intellectually consistent argument. We can follow a scientific approach and analysis to determine whether or not we think our respective policies will achieve the results we want. And I am happy to do so in a civil and responsible manner. But what I am no longer going to do is sit here and play make-believe with a bunch of politicians that tell us one thing out of one side of their mouth, immediately take power, and then do the exact opposite because it's always been their agenda in their first place. I don't know why they are so terrified of their law-abiding constituents being able to defend themselves. I don't know why they're so terrified, but I'm starting to become a lot more skeptical about their motives and their intentions. At some point, I am happy to give anyone that I talk to the benefit of the doubt, but at some point when you have proven that you are willing to use false data, bad analysis, when you're willing to be intellectually dishonest about what it is that you're trying to do, and when you're willing to flat out lie to me about what you're trying to do, all in a legislative policy which essentially gives individual citizens less power and you significantly more power, at some point, I'm not just questioning your judgment. Now I'm questioning your motivation. And if you think the United States is made up of a bunch of people that are simply going to roll over and hand over the very means that they have to protect themselves, their family, and their country. If you think they're going to do that because you've promised to take care of them, I have a feeling they're going to look at the same cities you've controlled for decades and view that with just a little bit of healthy skepticism. All right, that is all the time we have today on making the argument. I am sure that this issue is going to come up again, and as it does, and as different angles are tried and different arguments are used, we will come back with ways to break down that data, ways to break down the argument, and to talk about this in a meaningful way that hopefully doesn't just appeal to people that you already agree with, but that you can make a good argument that appeals to people that are at least willing to listen, willing to look at the data. And again, I would highly encourage you to go to Gun Owners of America. I think they've done a great job on analyzing this legislation. Another author I would encourage you to look at is John Lott. John Lott has done a lot of research. He's written a lot about gun control laws. One of the most fascinating things about gun control laws in the United States is you wouldn't know this, but for a long period of U.S. history, some of the strictest and most arbitrary gun laws were actually in the Jim Crow South. And it was specifically because they wanted the Klan to be able to have guns, but they didn't want black people to be able to have guns. So that's how your gun control, your common sense gun control was implemented in the Jim Crow South at one point. And there's fascinating research on that. And again, I'm not suggesting that everybody that supports gun control is a racist. I am suggesting that just about every racist believes in some form of gun control. So John Lott, Gun Owners America, great organization. There's some other ones out there as well that just do some good work on this. But read up on this. Don't be, again, they'll come up with a lot of stats and figures, especially some of the reports out of Australia and whatnot. If you just even do a basic research into the data that they're using and the argument they're using and the way they try to justify it, you'll be able to dismantle it pretty quickly. But ultimately, the underlying assumption is that if it's harder for a law-abiding citizen to be able to get a firearm, therefore it is less likely that violent crime will take place. I'm sorry, but that just doesn't add up. On a basic philosophical level, that doesn't add up, right? And again, the good news is the stats don't back it up either, right? So Gun Owners America, John Lott, great research there. Highly encourage you to look at that. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. If you're listening to this on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, you know what to do, right? 5-star rating, write us a review, give us some more ideas for future topics. This was a topic that was suggested to us by one of our listeners. Also, you can watch us on YouTube. In fact, if you are watching on YouTube right now, you'll see that I have a very special mug. It's actually a mug I got from my son. So my son is a big Star Wars fan. It's a picture of Darth Vader, and it says, who's your daddy? Now, why is this especially funny that I have this mug? Well, because my son's name is Luke. So, of course, I had to have this mug. But watch us on YouTube as well. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.